In 1951, the face of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh stared out from the cover of Time magazine as Man of the Year. To the world, he was the avatar of fiery nationalism, the frail old man who had dared to twist the tail of the British lion. He had achieved the impossible, the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. On paper, Iran now possessed the crown jewel of the energy world, the massive Abadan refinery, the largest facility of its kind on the planet. The mood in Tehran was electric. It was a moment of supreme national dignity. However, victory was an illusion. If you walked through the gates of Abadan just weeks later, you would not hear the roar of industry or the hiss of steam. Instead, you would hear the wind whistling through a labyrinth of silent pipes. The refinery, once the pulsating heart of the global oil trade, had been reduced to the world's most expensive pile of scrap metal. When the British technicians departed, they didn't just leave. They took the captains, the engineers, and the logistical maps with them. The paradox was cruel. Iran was sitting on a literal sea of black gold, yet the national treasury was hollow. The currency collapsed, inflation skyrocketed, and the very soldiers sworn to protect this newfound sovereignty went unpaid. This historical tragedy exposes a brutal truth. Nationalizing resources is meaningless if you cannot nationalize the supply chain and operational know-how. Mossadegh had seized the physical assets, but he failed to capture the intangible ecosystem that made them valuable. In the end, Iran purchased its national honor at the price of total economic isolation, paving the way for the collapse of its fragile democracy. The oil was theirs, but without the logistics to move it and the technology to refine it, it was worth nothing. While the pipes in Abadan fell silent, the noise in London and Washington reached a fever pitch. The crisis was played out on a high-stakes chessboard involving three distinct players, each driven by existential fears. Great Britain was not a mighty empire, but a dangerous, desperate player. Bankrupt after World War II, the British viewed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, not merely as a business, but as the iron lung keeping their economy breathing and the Royal Navy moving. The numbers tell the story of their desperation. In 1950, AIOC reaped $170 million in profit, while Iran received a paltry $16 million. London's aggressive stance wasn't just about oil. They could buy that elsewhere. It was about the survival of the pound sterling. They knew if Iran succeeded, the dominoes would fall all the way to the Suez Canal. Opposite them sat Mossadegh, a hero in a glass cage. Though adored by the crowds, the Prime Minister was trapped. He was squeezed between the radical demands of the Communist Today party and the jealous guarding of privilege by the royalists and clergy. To survive politically, Mossadegh was forced into a rigid, no-compromise corner. His strategy relied on a fatal delusion. He believed the global economy would collapse without Iranian oil, and that the United States would act as a distinct, honest broker to save him from the British. He misread the third player, the United States. As the White House transitioned from Truman to Eisenhower, the game changed entirely. Washington ceased caring about corporate ownership or fair deals. Their obsession shifted to the Cold War. They didn't care who owned the oil. They only cared who controlled the valve to keep the Soviets out of the Persian Gulf. Mossadegh was playing a legal game, but his opponents were playing a game of geopolitical survival. The collapse of Mossadegh's dream did not require a military invasion. It was achieved through a suffocating mechanism of economic warfare. The tangible price was the evaporation of cash flow. Britain weaponized maritime law, declaring any tanker carrying Iranian crude to be transporting stolen property. The threat terrified global shipping companies. The results were instantaneous and devastating. Iranian oil exports crashed from 242 million barrels in 1950 to virtually zero by 1952. The tap was turned off. To keep the government running, Tehran was forced to burn through its gold reserves and foreign currency, bleeding the nation dry. Yet, the intangible cost was even more lethal. When the British departed, they triggered a massive brain drain. They took the operational software, the complex refining schedules, blending formulas, and safety protocols, leaving Iran with only the hardware. Furthermore, Britain enforced a strict embargo on spare parts. Without replacement components, the Abadan refinery began to undergo industrial necrosis. The machinery literally started to rot and self-cannibalize. Iran possessed the factory, but without the supply chain, it was useless. The endgame was a devil's bargain. Following the CIA-backed coup that removed Mossadegh in 1953, the oil finally flowed again, but the ownership structure had shifted permanently. A new consortium was formed. The British AIOC retained 40%, but American companies now seized an equal 40% share, with the remainder going to Shell and the French. The naked truth was revealed. Iran had achieved nationalization in name only. The West retained the pricing power and control over production levels. The United States had officially replaced Great Britain as the primary power broker in the Middle East, teaching the world a harsh lesson. Sovereignty without control over the supply chain is merely a slogan. The final blow to Mossadegh's Iran did not come from a gun, but from a fountain pen in London. While the physical blockade was visible, the true strangulation happened in the quiet, mahogany-paneled boardrooms of the City of London. The British Empire, realizing it could no longer rule the waves by force alone, decided to redesign the rules of the game, weaponizing the global financial system against a single nation. First, they deployed the shadow ban. Through diplomatic back channels, London pressured international banks to freeze Iran's credit lines. But the ultimate weapon was Lloyd's of London. Britain simply forbade the insurance of any tanker carrying Iranian oil. In the maritime world, an uninsured ship is a ghost ship. No captain will sail it, and no port will receive it. This was not a blockade of steel, but of paper. To further tighten the noose, Britain engaged in lawfare, dragging Iran before the International Court of Justice. This turned every barrel of Iranian oil into a legal liability. Potential buyers from Italy and Japan, hungry for cheap energy, turned away not because they feared the British Navy, but because they feared British lawyers. Simultaneously, the enemy within began to devour the state. Iran fell into a classic structural trap, the monoculture economy. The nation was an addict, dependent on oil for 60–70% of its government revenue. When the British turned off the tap, they didn't just cut profits, they severed the country's jugular. Without this single point of failure, the government could not function. Schools, hospitals, and the military ground to a halt. Finally, a fatal disconnect emerged at home. Mossadegh, an aristocrat and intellectual, found himself isolated. As the state coffers emptied, he needed domestic funding to survive. However, he failed to mobilize the bazaris, the powerful class of traditional merchants, and the clergy, who controlled the nation's underground cash flow. These groups viewed Mossadegh's secular nationalism with suspicion. Unable to tap into the wealth of the bazaar and cut off from the wealth of oil, Mossadegh was left alone on the stage. The structural trap had snapped shut, leaving him with a bankrupt treasury and a disillusioned populace, perfectly setting the stage for the coup that was to come. The final act of this tragedy began not with the sound of gunfire, but with the silence of a rejected plea. The last straw arrived in June 1953. For months, Mossadegh had clung to a desperate hope that the United States, the beacon of anti-colonialism, would bail out Iran's drowning economy. That hope died with a single letter from President Eisenhower. The response was cold and final. The U.S. would grant no economic aid to Iran unless the oil dispute with Britain was settled. The diplomatic subtext was a sledgehammer. Iran was cornered. There would be no savior. The choice was no longer between sovereignty and submission. It was between capitulation and total annihilation. With the government paralyzed, the domino effect of Operation Ajax began. The streets of Tehran became the stage for a manufactured apocalypse. The economic strangulation finally broke the back of the common man. As the Iranian rial lost its value, the price of bread, the fuel of the revolution, soared, turning hunger into fury. Into this powder keg, the CIA and MI6 threw a lit match. Agents flooded the bazaars with suitcases full of cash, dollars and counterfeit rials, weaponizing the economy against the state. This money didn't buy oil, it bought chaos. Hired thugs, paid by foreign intelligence, roamed the streets alongside confused protesters, smashing shop windows and chanting conflicting slogans to manufacture an atmosphere of anarchy. Finally, the pillars of power crumbled. Mossadegh looked for his defenders, but found only empty uniforms. The army, unpaid and demoralized by the bankrupt treasury, saw no reason to die for a failing administration. Simultaneously, the clergy, who had once stood with the nationalists, grew terrified. Watching the chaos, they feared that the vacuum of power would be filled not by the Shah, but by the godless communists of the Tudeh party. Between a king and a comrade, they chose the king. The end came swiftly. On a sweltering August day, tanks rolled through Tehran, not to defend the prime minister, but to besiege his home. Mossadegh, the man who had once graced the cover of time, was forced to surrender, his house in ruins, and his dream dismantled. As he was hauled away into military custody, the Shah returned from his brief exile, reclaiming a throne restored not by the will of the people, but by the machinery of foreign intervention. The experiment was over. When the tanks finally stopped rolling and the smoke cleared over Tehran, the world looked at the scoreboard. The game was over, but the final audit revealed a result far more complex than a simple change of government. The winners were not who they appeared to be. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, reclaimed his peacock throne, but he returned not as a beloved monarch, but as a ruler sitting on the tip of a spear. He had secured his reign for another 25 years, yet he had traded his legitimacy for longevity. He was now a king installed by foreigners, presiding over a silence that was not peace, but suppressed rage. However, the true victor was the player who had entered the game last. The United States, having engineered the coup, walked away with the grand prize, a 40% stake in Iran's oil wealth without firing a single official shot. The British monopoly was broken, replaced by the rising sun of Pax Americana. Washington had successfully secured the Persian Gulf against the Soviets, cementing its role as the new hegemon of the Middle East. The losers included the very architects of the coup. For Great Britain, the victory was Pyrrhic. They had successfully decapitated Mossadegh, but they had also decapitated their own empire. The AIOC, later BP, returned, but they were forced to share their prize with American rivals. The coup marked the definitive end of British imperial exclusivity. The British lake had become an international waterway. But the most tragic loss was invisible. The fragile seedling of Iranian democracy was crushed in its infancy. By destroying a secular, nationalist government, the West inadvertently cleared the path for the only force left standing: religious fundamentalism. The suppression of 1953 did not kill the desire for independence. It merely radicalized it, planting the deep, bitter roots that would explode 26 years later in the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The philosophy of the fall. Looking back, the tragedy of Mossadegh offers a brutal lesson in the mechanics of power. It deconstructed the myth of national sovereignty in the modern age. The events proved that hard power, the physical possession of oil wells and refineries, is meaningless without soft power. True power lies not in the commodity itself, but in the invisible infrastructure that surrounds it. the shipping networks, the maritime insurance, the banking codes, and the technical know-how. Iran owned the oil, but the West owned the access to the world. Ultimately, Mossadegh's failure was one of political naivety. He was a man of the law who believed that moral righteousness and legal arguments were shields against aggression. He was playing a gentleman's game of chess, studying the board, relying on logic and international law. He never realized that his opponents were playing boxing. While he was quoting statutes at the International Court of Justice, they were freezing his bank accounts and bribing his army. He overestimated the world's morality and fatally underestimated the ruthlessness of national interest.